At the beginning of this course, I mentioned that the purpose of having continuous integration is that when multiple developers change the code and then they commit or push their code to the main source code repository, we want to build the code and make sure that none of these changes is going to break the actual source code. So in order to trigger that build, we have to either run the build in TeamCity manually or define some type of trigger that builds the code automatically every time a code change happens. And in this lecture, I want to show you how we can define triggers so that automatically code gets compiled. Back to TeamCity, as you know, we have a project called .NET Core, and if I go to its properties and configuration, on the left side of the screen, we created a VCS root version control system, and we connected to GitHub. And we had 4 build steps that restored the dependencies, compiled the code, and pushed it to Octopus Deploy, and also pushed some build information and metadata to Octopus Deploy. But we did that manually. We had to go and click on the run every time to compile this code and create the package. If you go to the triggers tab, you will see a new button which is called add new trigger. If we click on that, we can create different types of triggers. The most common ones and most important triggers are VCS trigger and schedule trigger. VCS trigger means that every time a change is detected in the source code in your version control system, the build is triggered. However, you can filter that which branches can trigger the build should they change. By default, all branches are monitored. That means that in any branch, if you make any changes, the build is going to be triggered. You can change this by providing branch name. For example, I can say master. This means that only if I change the code in master branch, the code is going to be compiled and build will be triggered. If you want help, you can click on this magic wand and then that gives you the list of branches. I can say, for example, if release candidate branch is changed, then trigger the build, and then you can save. If you want to exclude any branches, you can use minus instead of plus. For example, we can say add all branches, star mean all, and then we can say exclude RC branch. So minus means exclude and plus means include and star means everything. So again, I can just leave that to monitor RC branch only like this. Now, if we go to the code and make any changes, the build must trigger. Right now I'm in GitHub desktop and I'm on CI/CD demo repository on master branch. I can switch to RC branch and I can fetch the code. And if I go to code and make any changes, for example, if I add a couple of spaces to web.config, I can even do that with Notepad and save. Now, if I push this change to the RC branch, that's going to trigger the build. Normally, TeamCity waits a bit before it starts the build, and that is because it wants to make sure that if there are multiple changes coming to the repository, it can collect them and then start the build. As you see, the build started, and normally it takes about a minute for the build to start. That time that TeamCity waits is called the quiet time. So while this is being built, we can go to the build configuration settings and we can go back to triggers. If I edit this trigger, you will see that there is a show advanced options and you can customize this trigger to a great extent. As I said, there can be a quiet period setting. By default, it says don't use, or you can say when you detect a change, wait for 60 seconds and then start the build, or you can provide a custom value. For example, we can say wait for 15 seconds and then start the build. You can add also more complicated rules other than branch being monitor. For that, you can click on add new rule. And with this rule, you can say whether trigger the build or don't trigger the build. If any of these conditions happen, you can filter by username. For example, you can say if the username is a specific username, don't trigger the build. You can do this when you have a specific user that is used by a system, for example, by automation. You can say don't trigger the build or trigger the build. If you have more than one VCS root attached to your build configuration, you can choose the one that you want in here. You can also trigger the build or don't trigger the build based on on the comment that we put when we push the code. For example, in GitHub desktop, I typed a summary or a comment for the commit and pushed it, and you can basically trigger the build based on the comment as well. Or you can filter by file extensions. For example, you can say if the file has .xml, for example, or .config extension, don't trigger the build because that's just a config change. Most of the time, what you need is basically just the branch to be monitored. But if you want extra flexibility and options, you can click on Show Advanced Options. Another type of the trigger that we have is a schedule trigger, and in a schedule trigger you can basically plan your nightly builds or daily builds. For example, you can say I want to run this build daily, and at which time. For example, you can say I want to run it every midnight or every night, for example at 10 p.m. and that triggers the build. And this is good when you want to have nightly builds and you want to build your code every night to make sure that it's not broken, or to prepare a package for release every night. There are also extra options, which if you check the first option, you can delete any files that is generated during the build. Before every new build, you can delete those files, and you can click on save to have the schedule trigger as well. From my experience, VCS triggers must be used by care, because if you create a VCS trigger that monitors all branches and doesn't filter by username or anything, your build agents will be always building, and you may not really want to do that. One example and one use case is that if in GitHub you allow users to fork the code for themselves, if you watch all branches without any filtering, any fork in GitHub is basically a branch, and then when people are working on their own fork, you are always building their code as well, which I think the only time you need to trigger a build is when the actual source code repository is changing. When you create a VCS trigger like this, make sure that you specify explicit branches and you are not building any branch. And that is based on my experience, especially if you use Cloud Agent. You don't want your Cloud Agents to be always up and running because that incurs cost. It's better that you explicitly introduce branches.